They tore my brother's porch off while he was sitting in a physical therapy room trying to put his life back together. And when he came home, the one place where he could finally breathe was gone. Just gone. Nothing left but broken boards, rusty nails, and a pile of splintered wood sitting where his quiet little corner of peace used to be. The people who did it were not strangers, not criminals sneaking around in the middle of the night. They were the HOA board members from the neighborhood next door, led by a man named Richard Hale, who honestly believed the title on a committee gave him the power to do whatever he wanted. But what Richard didn't know was that he had made one very expensive mistake. He didn't just mess with the homeowner, he messed with my brother, a disabled veteran who had already fought battles most people will never understand. And he messed with me, someone who was willing to dig through every record, every document, and every dusty old file cabinet until I found the truth he was trying to hide. My brother Ethan had never been the kind of person who complained. That was probably one of the things I admired most about him. After 20 years serving in the military, after the injuries, the surgeries, and the long road of recovery that followed, he learned how to carry pain quietly. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't asking anyone to treat him differently. He just wanted a normal life again. His little house outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, was supposed to be that place. Nothing fancy, just a simple home with a backyard, an old oak tree, and a wooden porch he built himself piece by piece. That porch became more than just a structure attached to the house. It became his reset button. Every evening around sunset, he would sit there with a cup of coffee, listen to the birds, watch the sky change colors, and just let the day disappear for a while. He once told me, some days that 10 minutes on the porch is the only part of the day where my body doesn't feel like it's fighting me. And that sentence stayed with me, because that was the thing Richard Hale never understood. He saw wood, nails, and square footage. He didn't see a veteran trying to rebuild a life. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon. Ethan had left for his regular physical therapy appointment, the kind where he spent hours working through exercises that looked simple to anyone watching but were exhausting for him. When he came back home, he noticed something immediately. The driveway looked different. There were tire tracks in the dirt. The front yard was covered in pieces of lumber. At first, he thought maybe there had been some kind of accident. Maybe a storm had damaged the porch while he was gone. But then he walked closer and saw the truth. His porch wasn't damaged. It had been removed. Someone had taken it apart intentionally. The railing was gone. The steps were gone. The chair where he sat every evening was sitting upside down in the grass with scratches across the wood. Ethan just stood there for a moment, completely frozen. He called me, and I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Not anger, not even sadness. It was disbelief. He kept saying, "They actually did this. They actually came onto my property and took it away." When I got there, I found out exactly who they were. Richard Hale, the president of the neighboring HOA, had ordered a demolition crew to remove the porch. His explanation was written in a notice left on Ethan's door. According to Richard, the porch was an unauthorized exterior modification, and Ethan was allegedly behind on HOA obligations. The letter sounded official, full of intimidating words and warnings, the kind of paperwork designed to make ordinary people immediately feel powerless. But there was one problem, a very big problem. Ethan was not part of their HOA. Not now, not ever. He had never signed their agreement. He had never attended their meetings. He had never voted on their rules. And yet somehow, Richard's HOA had been collecting fees from him for years. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a simple neighborhood argument. Something about it felt wrong, really wrong. Because people make mistakes, communities have disagreements, and sometimes neighbors argue over fences or paint colors. But sending a demolition crew to destroy someone's property while they are away at medical treatment, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was someone believing they had power they didn't actually have. I remember looking at those broken porch boards scattered across Ethan's yard and thinking, "Okay, Richard, you want to play by paperwork? Fine. Let's see whose paperwork actually matters." The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I didn't call Richard. I didn't threaten him. I didn't give him any warning. I knew the only thing that could beat arrogance was proof. The records office was an old building that smelled like dust, paper, and decades of forgotten history. An elderly clerk named Martha helped me pull archived property maps from storage. She slid over these huge, yellow documents that looked like they had been sitting there since the beginning of time. I started tracing boundaries, comparing parcel numbers, checking every line carefully. And then I found it. There it was, printed clearly on the county map. Ethan's property, parcel number 7392B, was not inside Richard Hale's HOA boundaries. It wasn't even close. The entire foundation of Richard's authority was built on something that simply did not exist. And at that moment, I knew this wasn't going to end with an apology. Because Richard didn't just tear down a porch, he exposed a much bigger problem. And now I had the one thing he never expected me to find: proof. I walked out of that county records office holding a copy of the property map, and I remember sitting in my truck for a few minutes before I started the engine. I just stared at that paper sitting on the passenger seat, because sometimes you find the answer you were looking for, but the answer creates an even bigger problem. I wasn't surprised that Richard Hale had been wrong. People are wrong all the time. What bothered me was that he had been so confident while being wrong, and worse, he had used that confidence to hurt someone who never deserved it. So I drove straight to the HOA office. I wanted to see his reaction when the truth was sitting right in front of him. The HOA office was inside a small brick building near the neighborhood entrance, the kind of place with framed community awards on the walls and pictures of neighborhood events everywhere. It was designed to make people feel like everything was organized and professional. But after what happened to Ethan, those pictures felt different to me. They didn't look like community anymore. They looked like a company protecting its own image. Richard was sitting behind his desk when I walked in. He was exactly the kind of person you would expect in that position. Clean shirt, expensive watch, confident smile. The kind of person who always seemed prepared to explain why he was right before anyone even asked a question. He looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" he asked. I placed the county map on his desk. I didn't slam it down dramatically like something out of a movie, but I will admit, I enjoyed the moment. There's something satisfying about watching someone's confidence disappear slowly. "You need to explain why your crew destroyed my brother's porch," I said. Richard leaned back in his chair and glanced at the document. For a second, there was nothing. No reaction, no concern. Then he smiled again. "Your brother was notified about the violation," he said. "The HOA has authority over exterior modifications." I pointed at the map. "No, you don't." He looked down again. "Excuse me, this property isn't inside your HOA." The room got quiet. Not movie quiet, real quiet. The kind where someone is trying to figure out if they just heard something they don't want to believe. Richard picked up the paper and looked closer. "That's not possible," he said. "We've collected dues from him for years." And there it was, the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. Because Richard wasn't saying he had proof. He wasn't saying there was a mistake in the records. He was admitting that his entire argument was based on the fact that they had been taking money from my brother. I looked at him and said, "Richard, collecting money from someone doesn't magically give you ownership over their property." He didn't like that. I could see it immediately. His face changed just slightly. The confidence was still there, but the cracks were starting to show. "We have procedures," he said. "We have rules." I nodded. "Rules only matter when you actually have the authority to enforce them." I left that office knowing he wasn't going to admit anything. People like Richard rarely do that when they are cornered. They don't apologize first. They defend. They delay. They look for another way out. So I decided I wasn't going to argue with him anymore. I was going to let the system ask the questions he didn't want to answer. I filed a formal complaint with the State Community Association Oversight Division and submitted the county property records showing Ethan's home was outside their jurisdiction. I also contacted the county zoning department and provided everything I had, including the demolition notice, photographs of the destroyed porch, and the HOA documents that claimed authority they didn't legally have. Then we waited. And waiting is honestly one of the hardest parts of something like this. Because when someone hurts your family, every part of you wants instant justice. You want someone to walk into that office the next morning and say, "You're done." But real life doesn't work like that. Real life is paperwork, investigations, phone calls, and sitting at the kitchen table wondering if the people who caused the damage are going to actually face consequences. During that time, Ethan tried to stay calm. That was just who he was. One evening, I found him sitting in the backyard looking at the empty space where the porch had been. I asked him what he was thinking about. He shrugged and said, "I know it's just wood. I know people will say it's just a porch." Then he paused. "But they didn't just remove wood. They removed something I built when I was trying to put myself back together." That hit me harder than anything Richard had said, because suddenly, this wasn't about money. It wasn't about a structure. It was about respect. A few weeks later, the county finally started their review of Richard's HOA. At first, they looked only at the boundary issue. But once they started digging, they found more questions. They reviewed old financial records, enforcement letters, and property claims. They wanted to know why an HOA had been collecting fees from properties that were never legally part of the association. They wanted to know why liens had been threatened against homeowners who weren't under their authority. And most importantly, they wanted to know how a demolition company was allowed to remove someone's property without valid jurisdiction. The same organization that had been intimidating homeowners suddenly had to answer questions from people who were not impressed by their titles. Richard stopped appearing so confident at community meetings. Neighbors who once avoided conflict started asking questions. Some homeowners discovered they had been dealing with similar issues, where the HOA had stretched its authority further than it was allowed to go. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. The people who once whispered in hallways about Richard's decisions were now openly asking how long this had been happening. And then came the news that Richard never expected. The county found that the HOA had been improperly enforcing rules outside its legal boundaries. They were hit with a jurisdictional penalty of $12,000 per month until they corrected the violations and formally acknowledged the limits of their authority. Suddenly, the same man who had sent a demolition crew to my brother's house was now sitting across from attorneys, trying to explain why his organization believed it could control land it didn't own. The power had completely flipped, but the story wasn't over yet, because while Richard was dealing with the consequences of his decisions, my brother was still standing in the same backyard looking at the empty space where his porch used to be. And I knew that no fine, no investigation, and no paperwork could give him back the moment when he came home from therapy and realized someone had taken away the one place where he felt safe. The next part was about to be the one Richard hated the most, admitting that he was wrong. The strange thing about watching someone lose control is that it almost never happens the way people imagine. There is no dramatic moment where the music changes and everyone suddenly realizes who was right and who was wrong. Real life is much quieter than that. Power disappears slowly, piece by piece, through the little things people start noticing, the conversations that change, the respect that fades, and the moment when people stop accepting every word you say just because you say it confidently. That was exactly what happened to Richard Hale. The man who once walked through the neighborhood like he owned every street, every rule, and every decision suddenly became the person everyone wanted answers from. The same homeowners who used to sit quietly during HOA meetings, afraid to challenge him, started raising their hands and asking questions. They wanted to know why they had been paying fees they may not have owed. They wanted to know why rules had been enforced on properties outside the HOA boundaries. They wanted to know how a demolition crew was allowed to walk onto private property and remove part of someone's home. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't have an easy answer. He couldn't just point to a rulebook anymore. He couldn't hide behind the title of HOA president, because everyone had finally seen what happened when someone was given authority without accountability. A few weeks after the investigation began, my brother Ethan received a letter from the HOA. When I first saw it sitting on his kitchen table, I honestly expected the same thing we had seen before, Another warning, another legal-sounding threat, another carefully written message designed to make him feel like he was the one who had done something wrong. But this time, the tone was completely different. There were no accusations, no demands, no mention of violations, just an invitation to discuss a resolution. And I remember looking at that letter and thinking how interesting it was that the same people who had once sent a crew to tear down my brother's porch were now suddenly interested in having a conversation. Funny how quickly people learn the value of being reasonable when they realize intimidation no longer works. The meeting itself was nothing like the first time I had walked into Richard's office. Back then, he sat behind his desk with that calm little smile, barely looking at the documents I brought him because he already believed he had won. He thought I was just another frustrated family member who would eventually get tired, walk away, and accept whatever explanation he gave. But this time was different. This time, there were county records. There were official reviews. There were documents showing exactly where his authority ended. And suddenly, Richard Hale, the man who had made other people feel powerless, was the one sitting across the table trying to explain himself. The HOA agreed to reimburse Ethan $4,800 for the damage caused by the demolition, the cost of rebuilding the porch, the disruption it created in his recovery schedule, and the emotional stress that came with having part of his home destroyed without permission. They also removed every violation notice, every penalty, and every claim they had placed against his property. But the most important part was not the money. It was the admission. They had to officially acknowledge that Ethan's property was never under their jurisdiction. They had spent years acting like they had control over something that legally never belonged to them. They had built an entire system of authority on a mistake they refused to question. When Ethan read the paperwork, I expected him to feel satisfied. I thought he would finally feel like he had won. But that wasn't really who he was. He just sat there quietly, folded the papers, and placed them on the table. Then he looked at me and said something I never forgot. "You know what's funny? I don't even care about the money." I asked him what he meant. He looked toward the backyard where the new porch was starting to take shape and said, "I just wanted someone to admit they were wrong." And that was the moment I realized this whole thing had never really been about wood, nails, or a few $1,000s. It was about dignity. It was about a man who had already sacrificed so much. Someone who had spent years rebuilding himself after serving his country. Being treated like his own home didn't belong to him. The porch was just the thing they could see. The real damage was the feeling that someone could walk onto your property, take something away, and expect you to stay quiet. When the new porch was finally finished, Ethan decided not to rebuild it exactly the same way. He told me, if I'm going to build it again, I might as well make it better. He added stronger support beams, wider steps, and a small corner where he could keep his chair and his plants. The funny thing was, the new porch became more than the old one ever was. Neighbors who barely knew Ethan before started stopping by. People brought coffee. They asked how he was doing. Some admitted they had experienced problems with the HOA, but never felt brave enough to challenge Richard. One neighbor, an older man named Carl, said something that stuck with me. He told me, "People like Richard don't stay powerful because they're unbeatable. They stay powerful because everyone assumes fighting back isn't worth the trouble." And honestly, I think that was the biggest lesson from everything that happened. Sometimes people don't abuse power because nobody notices. They abuse power because they believe nobody will challenge them. About a month later, I saw Richard for the last time. I was leaving a community meeting when he walked out of the building carrying a thick folder. He looked different, not angry, not defeated, just tired. The kind of tired that comes when someone realizes the story they have been telling themselves for years is finally falling apart. He saw me standing there, and for a second I thought he might say something. Maybe apologize. Maybe admit that he had made a mistake. But he didn't. He simply looked away and kept walking. As he passed by, I noticed the label on the folder in his hand. It read, "Jurisdiction Review and Surrender Documentation." And I have to admit, there was something almost poetic about that moment. The same man who once believed he had the right to control someone else's property was now carrying paperwork proving he never had that right in the first place. Some people told me I went too far. They said I should have handled things privately. They said I should have just asked for the porch to be rebuilt and moved on. And maybe if Richard had simply made an honest mistake, I might have agreed. Everyone makes mistakes. Documents can be confusing. Boundaries can be misunderstood. Neighbors can disagree. That is normal. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding. A mistake is when you discover the truth and accept responsibility. What Richard did was different. He ignored the possibility that he was wrong because he believed his position mattered more than the facts. He trusted his title more than the law. He believed having control over a community meant having control over people. And that is where the line was crossed. Because communities need rules. They need organization. They need people willing to work together. But there is a huge difference between creating order and creating fear. There is a difference between protecting a neighborhood and controlling the people who live there. Today, Ethan still sits on that porch. Most evenings, right around sunset, he takes his coffee outside, leans back in his chair, and watches the sky change colors. Sometimes I visit him, and we sit there without saying much. We don't talk about Richard. We don't talk about the investigation. We just enjoy the quiet. And maybe that is the best ending this story could have had. Because the porch was never really about the porch. It was about taking back a piece of life that someone else tried to take away. So maybe I did go too far. Maybe some people believe I should have walked away. But I believe everyone has a moment when they have to decide whether staying silent is easier than standing up. And I want to know what you think. If someone destroyed something important to you while claiming they had authority they never actually had, would you fight back like I did? Or would you choose peace and walk away? Was this about revenge? Or was it about accountability? Where do you think the line should be between community rules and personal freedom? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest battles are not about money, property, or paperwork. They are about making sure people remember that every person deserves to be respected in their own home.